It was a quiet evening in a small countryside town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name. The air was cool, and the streets were almost empty except for a few dim streetlights glowing through the mist. A man named Daniel was walking back home after a long day at his small workshop. He was a carpenter, known for fixing old furniture and building wooden pieces for people around the town. His hands were rough and his clothes carried the smell of wood and varnish, but he took pride in his simple work. That evening, the road was unusually silent. Even the crickets seemed to have stopped their usual song. As Daniel walked past an old bridge near the edge of town, something caught his attention near the side of the road. It was a large wooden box lying partly hidden behind a patch of bushes. At first he thought it was just junk someone had thrown away, but as he got closer he realized it looked different. The box wasn't like the ones he usually saw. It was made of thick, dark wood, almost like oak, and had strange carvings along the edges. They weren't fancy designs, just odd lines and shapes that didn't seem to have any clear meaning. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at it. It looked heavy, and the lid was sealed shut with a rusty metal latch. His first thought was that someone might have left it there accidentally, but then he noticed how carefully it had been placed. The grass beneath it was flattened as if it had been set down gently rather than dropped. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one in sight. The road was empty, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves. He hesitated for a moment, then crouched beside the box and brushed off the dust and dirt that had gathered on top. There was no label, no name, no address, just that old wood and the smell of damp soil. Strange, he muttered under his breath. For some reason, the box made him uneasy. Maybe it was the carvings, or maybe it was the silence around him. But curiosity got the better of him. He tried to lift it slightly to see how heavy it was. To his surprise, it was heavier than it looked. Something inside was definitely adding weight. He considered leaving it there and walking away, but something about it bothered him. What if it was important? What if it had something valuable? Or worse, what if it belonged to someone in trouble? After a moment of thinking, he decided to take it with him. He lifted one end carefully, grunting from the weight, and managed to drag it into his old pickup truck parked nearby. Once it was in the back, he tied it down and started driving home, still wondering what he had just found. The ride home felt longer than usual. The box rattled slightly in the back whenever he hit a bump, and each sound made him more curious. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, as if expecting the lid to open on its own. Of course, nothing happened, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. When he reached home, he parked in his driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there for a minute. The night had grown darker and clouds covered the moon. The box sat silently in the back, almost as if it was waiting for him to do something. He finally stepped out, grabbed his flashlight, and went around to look at it again. The carving seemed deeper under the light, the lines twisting in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Daniel wasn't the type to believe in strange stories or superstitions, but that night, something about it felt different. He decided to leave the box in his shed for the night. It was late and he was tired. Maybe in the morning with some daylight it wouldn't seem so strange anymore. He pulled the box inside the shed, locked the door, and went into his small wooden house. After washing up, he sat by the table with a cup of tea, trying to relax. But his mind kept going back to the box. He tried to distract himself by turning on the radio, but every few minutes he thought he heard faint sounds, a soft tap or something shifting in the shed. He told himself it was just his imagination. Old wood made noises all the time, especially when the temperature changed. Still, the thought of something being inside it wouldn't leave him alone. When it was time for bed, Daniel blew out the lamp and lay down, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Somewhere outside, the wind began to pick up. He turned on his side, closed his eyes, and tried to sleep. But just as he started drifting off, a faint noise reached his ears. It was coming from the direction of the shed. It wasn't loud, just a soft thump followed by another one. His eyes opened immediately. He sat up, listening carefully. It came again, and this time clearer. He frowned, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside. The air was cold and still, and the grass was wet with dew. The shed stood at the far end of his small yard, dark and quiet. He unlocked the door slowly and aimed his flashlight inside. Everything looked as it had before. The box sat in the middle of the floor, still shut, still harmless. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing softly on the wooden boards. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic sound like something lightly tapping from inside the box. His heart began to pound. He took a step back, unsure what to do. Maybe it was an animal trapped inside, a raccoon or a cat, but the box was sealed so tight. How could something even breathe in there? He crouched down and placed his hand on the lid. The tapping stopped. He waited, holding his breath, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. After a moment, he stood up and left the shed, locking it again behind him. He told himself he'd deal with it in the morning. He couldn't think straight at that hour. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just starting to rise, and the sky was painted in soft orange. He walked to the shed with a crowbar in hand. If something was trapped in that box, he needed to let it out. He took a deep breath, unlocked the shed, and stepped inside. The box looked the same, though a part of him swore it had shifted slightly from where he'd left it. He knelt down, ran his fingers along the edges, and felt the rusted latch. The metal was old, but it held firm. "All right," he whispered to himself. "Let's see what's inside you." He wedged the crowbar under the latch and pushed. The metal groaned but didn't give. He pushed harder, sweat forming on his forehead. Finally, with a sharp snap, the latch broke open. He paused for a moment, listening. Nothing. He lifted the lid slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet morning air. For a second, he couldn't see anything. It was dark inside, and his flashlight beam trembled slightly in his hand. Then, as the light moved across the inside of the box, his eyes widened. There was a small blanket, torn, dirty, but clearly wrapped around something. He leaned closer, carefully lifting one corner of it. His heart nearly stopped when he saw a small hand underneath. It was pale, motionless at first, then twitched slightly. Daniel stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He froze, not knowing what to do. Then he heard the faintest sound and a weak, shallow breath. "Oh my God," he whispered. Without thinking, he leaned forward and gently pulled the blanket aside. There, lying curled up inside the wooden box, was a little girl. She looked fragile, her hair tangled, her face pale as if she hadn't seen sunlight in days. Her eyes were half open, but she didn't speak. She just looked terrified, too weak to move. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for his phone. He called emergency services right away, barely able to explain what he'd found. Within minutes, he heard sirens approaching in the distance. He stayed by the girl, speaking softly to her, trying not to scare her. "It's all right," he said gently. "You're safe now. Help's coming." She blinked slowly but said nothing. When the paramedics arrived, they moved quickly. One of them checked her pulse and nodded. "She's alive," he said firmly. They lifted her carefully out of the box and placed her on a stretcher. Daniel stood aside, still in shock. The officers asked him a few questions, where he found the box, how long it had been there, but he barely heard them. His mind was spinning. Who would do something like that, and why? As they drove away with the girl, Daniel stood in front of his shed, staring at the empty box. The carvings along the side suddenly seemed darker, almost menacing in the sunlight. He couldn't understand how something so ordinary looking could hide something so terrible. He took one last look, then covered the box with a tarp. He knew this was far from over. The girl was alive, and thank God, but the questions that followed would change everything. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that small hand, those frightened eyes, and the faint rise and fall of her breathing. Somewhere deep down, he knew he had just stepped into something far bigger than he could imagine. And though he didn't know it yet, what he found inside that wooden box was only the beginning of a story that would shake his quiet little town to its core. The morning after the shocking discovery, Daniel's small house felt different. The same walls and furniture surrounded him, but the air inside carried an uneasy silence. He sat at the kitchen table, staring into his untouched cup of tea. The image of the little girl inside that box refused to leave his mind. He had seen many strange things in his life, but nothing like this. Every time he blinked, he saw her pale face and those frightened eyes looking up at him. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. When he opened it, 2 police officers stood outside. They introduced themselves and asked if they could come in to talk. Daniel nodded quietly and stepped aside. The taller officer began by thanking him for calling the authorities quickly. The girl, he said, was alive and stable at the hospital, but still very weak. She hadn't spoken yet, and the doctors were trying to help her recover from the shock and exhaustion. Daniel listened carefully, his hands folded on the table. "Do you know who she is?" he asked quietly. The officers exchanged a look. "Not yet," the taller one replied. "We're checking missing persons reports. It seems she might have been missing for quite some time, but we'll know more soon." The other officer opened a small notebook. "Can you tell us again exactly how you found the box?" he asked. Daniel explained everything from the beginning. How he was walking home, saw the box near the ditch, and decided to take it because it looked unusual. He told them about hearing noises during the night and how he finally opened it the next morning. As he spoke, his voice trembled slightly. The officers took notes and asked a few follow-up questions, but they could tell he was being truthful. He was still shaken. After they left, Daniel walked out to the shed again. The wooden box was still there, covered with the tarp. It looked harmless in the daylight, but knowing what had been inside gave it a strange weight. He stood there for a long time staring at it, thinking about what could have happened if he hadn't decided to take it home. What if it had stayed out there another night? What if it had started raining? The thought made him shiver. Later that afternoon, the police returned with a forensic team. They wanted to take the box for investigation. They handled it carefully, dusting for fingerprints and collecting small samples. One of the officers explained that they would examine everything, the carvings, the wood, even the blanket that had been inside, for clues. Daniel helped them lift it into the van. As they drove away, he felt both relieved and strangely empty. That box had brought something terrible into his life, yet taking it away left him unsettled. The next few days were filled with questions. Reporters started arriving in the area after hearing about the strange discovery. People in town stopped Daniel on the street to ask what really happened. Some said he was a hero. Others whispered theories, that maybe it was part of some dark ritual or smuggling incident. Daniel didn't know what to say. He wasn't looking for attention. All he wanted was to understand why that child had been left like that. On the third day, one of the detectives called him and asked if he could come to the police station. When Daniel arrived, he was taken into a small room where the same two officers were waiting. They told him the girl had finally spoken. She hadn't said much, but she had managed to give them a few details. Her name was not in any of the missing person files yet, but she mentioned a small town nearly 2 hours away. The officers believed she had been taken from there several months ago. "She's still scared," the taller officer explained. "She doesn't remember everything clearly, but she said she was kept in different places and then put in that box." Daniel sat quietly, feeling a deep sadness for the little girl. "Why would someone do that?" he asked softly. The officer sighed. "We don't know yet, but we'll find out." They asked Daniel a few more questions, mostly about the exact spot where he found the box. He remembered the road well, the dirt track, the broken fence, and the small patch of bushes beside the ditch. The detectives said they had already checked the area and found faint tire marks leading away from it. The marks were fresh, maybe less than a day old when Daniel discovered the box. That meant whoever left it there didn't go far. As Daniel was about to leave, one of the officers said, "The girl's condition is improving. Once she's stronger, she might be able to tell us more." Daniel nodded and thanked them before heading home. That night he couldn't stop thinking about her. He wondered if she was able to eat something or if she was sleeping better now. He hoped she wasn't too afraid of everyone around her. A few days later, Daniel received another call. This time, it was the hospital. They said the girl was awake and that she kept asking about the man with the flashlight. Daniel knew she meant him. The nurse asked if he would come by, as it might help her feel safe. He agreed immediately. When he reached the hospital, the nurse led him to a small room at the end of the corridor. The girl was sitting up in bed wrapped in a blanket. Her hair had been washed and she looked a little stronger. When she saw him enter, she didn't speak at first, but her eyes softened. Daniel gave a small smile and said gently, "Hey there, you're safe now." She looked at him for a long moment before whispering, "You opened the box." Daniel nodded. "Yes, I did. I'm glad I did." She didn't say much after that, but she seemed calmer. The nurse thanked him for coming and said his presence had made a difference. Before he left, the girl said softly, "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but they carried more weight than anything he had heard in a long time. Outside the hospital, Daniel met one of the detectives who was still investigating the case. The man told him they had made progress. The fingerprints found on the box didn't belong to anyone in the police database, but a piece of fabric discovered nearby matched material from an abandoned house outside the neighboring town. The officers had gone there earlier that morning, and it looked like someone had left in a hurry. They found traces of food, old clothes, and more wooden pieces, similar to the ones used for the box. The detective explained that the house might have been one of several places where the group was hiding. Daniel listened carefully, trying to take it all in. He never imagined that his simple act of curiosity, stopping by the side of the road, would uncover something so dark. The officer assured him they were following strong leads and that the girl's information had already helped narrow down suspects. Over the next week, the investigation grew. Several nearby towns were checked for missing children, and soon they confirmed the girl had been reported missing almost 6 months earlier. Her parents had searched for her tirelessly but had nearly lost hope. When they received the call from the authorities, they couldn't believe she was alive. The reunion was arranged quietly away from the media. Daniel wasn't there, but the detective later told him that the girl ran straight into her mother's arms, crying. The story made him emotional. He couldn't stop thinking how close she had come to never being found. Soon after, Daniel was invited to the police station again, not for questioning this time, but to thank him officially. The local news had already started covering the story, calling him the man who found the box. People stopped him in the grocery store, wanting to shake his hand. It felt strange for him. He wasn't used to being noticed. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He had just done what he thought was right. Even after things started to settle, Daniel couldn't go back to his normal life right away. His workshop felt emptier than before. Every time he looked at a piece of wood, he remembered that box and the carvings, the smell, the sound from inside. One evening, he sat outside his house watching the sunset when the same detective stopped by. They sat together for a while, talking quietly. The detective told him that the investigation had revealed more than they expected. The people responsible were part of a small group involved in illegal activities, including trafficking. The little girl's rescue had helped them uncover a larger network. Several arrests had already been made. The officer said, "If you hadn't stopped that night, we might never have found her. You saved her life and you helped stop something much worse." Daniel didn't know what to say. He just nodded, feeling both proud and deeply sad. He looked toward the horizon, the sun dipping below the trees. The world looked peaceful again, but he knew how fragile that peace could be. Inside, he felt thankful. Thankful that he listened to his instincts that night. Thankful that the girl was safe. And thankful that a simple act of kindness could change so much. When he went back inside his house, he looked at the small wooden carving on his table, a bird he had been working on before all of this started. He picked it up, turned it in his hand, and smiled faintly. Life would go on, and soon people would stop talking about the box. But he would never forget that night or the moment he opened it and found a life that needed saving. For him, it was a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary days can hold the most extraordinary moments. Moments that change not just one person's life, but many. Days passed, and Daniel's life slowly began to return to something that looked like normal. But deep down, nothing really felt the same. Every morning when he stepped into his workshop, he still thought about that box. The sound of it scraping across the wooden floor, the moment the latch broke open, and the sight of that frightened little girl. Those memories clung to him, like the smell of sawdust that never left his hands. Sometimes, while sanding a piece of wood, he would stop and look out the window, lost in thought. He wondered how the girl was doing. The police had told him she was recovering well and that she was back with her family now. That news made him happy but also restless. He kept thinking about everything that had happened and the strange feeling that it wasn't over yet. One morning, just as he was opening his workshop, a familiar voice called his name. It was the detective who had been working on the case. He looked tired, his eyes showing the kind of weariness that comes from sleepless nights and long days. Daniel invited him inside and they sat. Found his notes and they tell us everything. Daniel listened silently, his eyes fixed on the detective's face. "So it's really over?" he asked quietly. The detective nodded slowly. "Almost. The others involved have been arrested. It turns out there was a small network behind all of this. People who took advantage of those who didn't have much, tricking them into helping with their work. The carpenter was one of them. He built the boxes, but he wasn't the one deciding what happened next. The group used those boxes to transport people, to hide them, to move them from one place to another without being noticed. He stopped, his voice tightening slightly. The girl you found, she was one of the lucky ones. Daniel looked down at his hands. They were steady, but his heart felt heavy. And the others? He asked softly. We found 2 more children alive, the detective said. They were scared, but safe now. The rest, we're still checking. It's going to take time. For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Daniel said quietly, At least they're free now. The detective nodded. Yes, and there's more. The girl's been asking about you again. She's doing much better now, talking, eating, even smiling. Her family wanted to meet you properly, to thank you. I told them I'd ask if you'd be willing. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure what he would say if he saw her again. What could he say to someone who had been through something so terrible? Still, he felt it was something he needed to do. All right, he said finally. I'll go. A few days later, he drove to the small town where the girl's family lived. The detective accompanied him, guiding him through narrow streets until they reached a modest white house with a garden full of flowers. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful for what that family had endured. When Daniel stepped out of the car, the girl's mother came to greet him. Her eyes were filled with gratitude and emotion. She shook his hand tightly and said, You saved my daughter's life. There are no words to thank you for that. Daniel felt awkward under her kindness. I just found the box, he said softly. Anyone would have done the same. She smiled faintly, shaking her head. Maybe, but you were the one who stopped. The one who cared. They went inside, and there she was, the little girl sitting on a couch with a soft blanket around her shoulders. When she saw Daniel, her face brightened, and she gave a small, shy smile. She looked stronger now, her cheeks fuller, her eyes more alive. Daniel smiled back gently. You look better, he said. She nodded. I feel better, she replied softly. Her voice was still quiet, but it no longer carried the fear he remembered. They talked for a little while, though most of the time was filled with quiet moments, smiles, glances, and the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. At one point, the girl picked up a small wooden bird from the table beside her. Daniel recognized it instantly. It was one of his carvings. Her mother said, The detective brought it to her when she was in the hospital. She keeps it by her bed. That simple thing made Daniel's chest tighten. He had made that bird months ago without thinking much about it. Now it seemed to have found a purpose, a small symbol of hope for someone who had lost so much. Before leaving, the girl looked at him and said, I used to think no one would find me. Daniel smiled sadly. I didn't find you, he said. You called out. I just listened. She smiled back, and for a brief moment everything felt still, peaceful, almost like the world was right again. After the visit, Daniel drove home in silence. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky with orange and gold. The detective said quietly, You know, you might not realize it, but what you did started all of this. Without you, we wouldn't have found any of them. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. I was just in the right place at the right time, he said. The detective shook his head. No, you cared enough to stop. That's not luck. That's heart. When Daniel got home, the night had already fallen. He sat outside on his porch, listening to the crickets. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of calm. The fear, the tension, it all seemed to fade slowly into the quiet night air. But there was still something inside him that kept turning, a thought he couldn't quite let go. He went into his workshop and pulled out an old piece of wood. As he began to carve, he thought about how much one small action can change so many lives. A man walking home, a box by the road, a sound inside, and all simple things. Yet they had led to a story that no one could have imagined. In the following weeks, Daniel started visiting schools and community centers in nearby towns, not as a speaker or a hero, but simply to share what had happened, how paying attention can save lives. He spoke about trust, about listening to your instincts, and about helping others even when it seems inconvenient. People listened, and slowly more volunteers joined local safety programs. The police began working closely with communities to prevent similar crimes from ever happening again. The little girl's family stayed in touch with Daniel. They sent him small updates, pictures of her starting school again, learning to draw, smiling more each day. Each photo reminded him why it all mattered. One evening, a few months later, he received a letter in the mail. It was from the girl. The handwriting was a bit uneven, the words carefully written in pencil. It read, "Dear Daniel, thank you for finding me. I don't remember everything that happened, but I remember your face and your voice. You told me I was safe, and I believed you. I don't get scared at night anymore. My mom says you are brave, but I think you are kind. That's better than brave." From your friend, L. Daniel read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it inside a small wooden box he had made just for it. Every once in a while, he would open that box and read the letter again, especially on quiet nights when the world felt too still. It reminded him that even the smallest choices can create ripples that change everything. The detective eventually retired, but he and Daniel stayed in touch. Sometimes they met for coffee, and the conversation always drifted back to that night. How one wooden box revealed not just a crime, but a chain of human kindness that followed. Life went on, but Daniel carried the memory like a shadow, not heavy but constant. He learned to see the world differently, to notice the small things that others ignored. Every object, every sound, every person seemed to hold a story waiting to be discovered. Years later, when people in town spoke about the man who found the girl in the wooden box, they talked about him with quiet respect. But Daniel never called himself a hero. To him, it was simply a story about listening to the world, to your heart, to the moments that seem small but aren't, and sometimes, when the night grew quiet and the wind rustled through the trees, he thought he could still hear that faint, rhythmic sound, and not of fear anymore, but of life. A reminder that kindness once given never truly disappears. It just echoes quietly, finding its way to those who need it most. Time has a quiet way of moving forward. Months had passed since the night Daniel opened that old wooden box, yet the memory of it still felt close, like something that never really left him. The town had slowly returned to its calm rhythm, but for Daniel, life had changed in quiet, meaningful ways. He still worked in his small carpentry shop every morning, but now when people visited him, they didn't just come for furniture. They came to talk, to listen, and sometimes to thank him for reminding them that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference. The case that had once filled news headlines had finally come to an end. The people responsible were caught and sentenced, and the story that began with a box by the road ended in justice. For many, it was a reminder of how fragile safety can be, and how one person's decision to care can uncover truths that others choose to ignore. One cold morning, Daniel sat by his window sipping his tea as sunlight spilled across his table. A gentle knock came at the door. When he opened it, he found the detective standing there again, smiling like an old friend. "You're hard to find these days," the detective said with a grin. Daniel chuckled softly. "I don't go far," he replied. "You know where to look." The detective handed him a small envelope. "I thought you'd want to see this." Inside was an invitation. It was for a small ceremony in the nearby city. The letter said the police department, along with several community groups, were honoring local citizens who helped in cases that made a difference. Daniel's name was printed neatly among them. "I don't know about this," Daniel said, frowning slightly. "I didn't do anything special." The detective shook his head. "You did more than most people ever would. Come, it's not about medals. It's about letting people see what caring looks like." A week later, Daniel traveled to the city for the event. It was held in a simple hall with wooden chairs and flowers lined along the stage. There were people of all kinds: officers, social workers, volunteers, even a few teachers and families who had helped rebuild lives after tragedies. When Daniel's name was called, he felt his heart beat faster. He wasn't used to attention. He walked up quietly, shook hands, and received a small plaque. The applause was warm and honest, and though he didn't like the spotlight, he could feel the sincerity in the room. After the event, as people mingled and shared stories, Daniel noticed a familiar face among the crowd. The girl, the one from the box, was standing near the entrance with her mother. She looked taller now, her hair neatly braided, her eye bright with confidence. When she saw him, she smiled widely and waved. He walked over, smiling in return. "You look happy," he said gently. She nodded. "I am. I started school again. I have new friends," her mother added softly. "She talks about you often. She says you helped her believe that there are still good people in the world." Daniel didn't know what to say. He just smiled and said, "You helped me believe that too." They talked for a while. laughing at small things, catching up on simple details. The kind of ordinary conversation that feels extraordinary when you know what came before it. Before leaving, the girl handed him a small envelope. "Don't open it now," she said shyly. "Open it when you get home." That night, back in his workshop, Daniel placed the envelope on his workbench. He sat quietly for a moment, the faint smell of sawdust in the air, and then opened it. Inside was a simple drawing, a box with rays of light coming out of it. Standing beside it was a small figure holding hands with a taller one. At the bottom, written in uneven letters, were the words, "You opened the box, but you also opened my life." Daniel felt his eyes sting. He placed the drawing on his shelf beside the little wooden bird and the letter she had sent months ago. Those two small things, a letter and a drawing, meant more to him than any award could. Life continued quietly after that. Seasons changed, people moved on, and the town slowly stopped talking about the story of the wooden box. But Daniel carried its lessons in his heart. He became more involved with the community, helping to start workshops for local kids where they learned simple carpentry and crafts. He taught them how to shape wood, how to be patient, how to notice the small details others often overlook. Sometimes, when he told stories to the children, he would begin with, "Once, I found something strange by the road," and their eyes would widen, eager to hear what happened next. He never told it as a tale of fear, though. He told it as a story about listening, about how sometimes the quietest sounds carry the loudest messages. The detective retired that same year. Before leaving, he visited Daniel one last time. They sat on the porch as the sun went down, two old friends sharing comfortable silence. After a while, the detective said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "but then I realized and it wasn't about stopping. It was about paying attention. We all pass by things every day that seem small, but they're not. We just have to look closer." The detective smiled. "You know, you've turned this into something good." "That's rare." Daniel looked out toward the fading light. "Good things grow out of dark places sometimes," he said softly. "You just have to give them a chance." Years passed. The girl grew up. She would occasionally send letters to Daniel, short notes telling him about her school, her drawings, or her dreams. One letter said she wanted to become a nurse one day, to help others the way people helped her. Another letter had a photo attached, her smiling in a school uniform standing in a garden. Each time he received one, Daniel would smile, proud and quietly grateful. He never forgot that night or the sound from that box. But he stopped seeing it as something frightening. Instead, it became a reminder that kindness is the light that shines in the darkest places. One spring morning, years later, Daniel sat in his garden, surrounded by the sound of birds and the smell of blooming flowers. A car stopped near his house, and when he looked up, he saw a young woman step out. She was grown now, with the same bright eyes but a more confident stride. "Do you remember me?" she asked, smiling. Daniel laughed softly. "I think I could never forget." They sat outside, drinking tea, talking about life. She told him she had started working as a volunteer at a shelter, helping children who had been through hard times. "You showed me what it means to care," she said. "I wanted to do the same for others." Daniel looked at her, his heart full. "You've already done more than you know," he said. They talked until the sun dipped low, and before leaving, she said something that stayed with him long after. "That box you opened, I used to think it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But now I think maybe it was also the beginning of something good, because it brought me here. It brought kindness back into my life." After she left, Daniel sat quietly, thinking about her words. The wind moved gently through the trees, and for the first time he realized something. That the story wasn't about the box, or the fear, or even about him. It was about what happens when someone decides to care. It was about how one act can travel from one person to another, touching lives far beyond what anyone could imagine. He looked around his workshop, filled with the soft golden light of the evening. On his shelf were the drawing, the letter, and the little wooden bird, small reminders of a big story. He smiled, feeling peaceful. The world was still full of mystery and sadness at times, but it was also full of people who could make it better, one quiet choice at a time, and somewhere deep in his heart, Daniel knew that as long as people listened, really listened, there would always be hope. He stood, dusted off his hands, and picked up a fresh block of wood. As he began to carve, the sound of his tools filled the room, steady, calm, and full of life. Outside, the sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear. The day had ended, but its warmth stayed, lingering like a promise. A promise that no matter how dark the world might get, light can always be found, sometimes inside the most unexpected places, like a quiet wooden box waiting by the side of the road, and sometimes inside the hearts of ordinary people who choose to care.